It's a blistering summer day in 1942, somewhere in the ruins of Sevastopol. The city that had once been a jewel of the Black Sea coast now resembles something out of a nightmare. Buildings reduced to skeletal husks, their walls pockmarked with bullet holes and shrapnel scars. The smell of cordite hangs thick in the air, mixing with the acrid stench of smoke and death. In the distance, artillery rumbles like an approaching thunderstorm that never quite arrives, just maintains its menacing presence on the horizon. And there, hidden among the rubble, absolutely motionless for the last 14 hours, lies a young woman, 25 years old, Ukrainian, a history student who should be sitting in a university lecture hall discussing Bohdan Khmelnytsky or the Cossack uprisings. Instead, she's pressed against the shattered remains of what was once someone's home, her eye fixed to the scope of a Mosin Nagant rifle, watching, waiting, barely breathing. Her name is Lyudmila Pavlichenko, though the German soldiers across no man's land know her by a different name entirely. They call her the Russian bitch from hell. Her own people have given her a somewhat more poetic moniker, Lady Death. And on this particular sweltering afternoon, she's engaged in a duel that has already stretched across 3 days and 3 nights, a deadly game of cat and mouse with an enemy sniper who's equally determined to be the last one standing when the sun finally sets. Somewhere out there, perhaps 400 meters away, perhaps closer, another set of eyes peers through another scope. Another finger rests on another trigger. Another heart beats with the same mixture of patience, fear, and predatory focus. For 3 days they've been hunting each other through the devastated cityscape, each looking for that one moment of carelessness, that single second when the other's guard drops just enough. Neither has found it yet. The slightest movement could mean death, a glint of sunlight off a scope, the small cloud of dust kicked up by shifting position. Even the shadow cast by a helmet might be enough to give away a location. So Lyudmila stays frozen, ignoring the cramps that scream through her legs, the thirst that turns her throat to sandpaper, the flies that crawl across her face. Her world has shrunk to the narrow field of view through her scope and the steady rhythm of her breathing. In, out, out. Each breath measured, controlled, barely disturbing the air. This is what they never tell you about sniping. It's not the marksmanship that's hard, though that certainly matters. It's not even the killing, though that takes its own toll on the soul. It's the waiting, the endless, agonizing waiting. 15, 18, sometimes 20 hours lying in the same position, barely moving, becoming part of the landscape, your body screaming at you to shift, to stretch, to do anything to relieve the building discomfort. But you can't, because the moment you do, you're dead. Lyudmila has gotten very good at waiting. She's also gotten remarkably good at killing. The official tally stands at 309 confirmed enemy combatants, 309 human beings who woke up one morning, ate breakfast, wrote letters home, thought about their families, and then stepped into the crosshairs of a young Ukrainian woman who had the patience of a saint and the aim of a goddess. And included in that count are 36 enemy snipers, men who were supposed to be among the best marksmen the Wehrmacht had to offer. But she's not thinking about numbers right now. Right now, her entire universe has condensed down to a pile of rubble about 380 meters to the northeast, where she suspects, though she can't be certain, that her opponent has taken position. She saw something 3 hours ago, the briefest flicker of movement that might have been a rifle barrel, might have been a piece of cloth caught by the wind, might have been nothing at all. But her instincts, honed by months of combat, tell her that's where he is. So she watches, and she waits, and on the 3rd day, he makes his mistake. It's tiny, almost imperceptible. A slight adjustment of position that causes a small cascade of loose stones to tumble down the rubble pile. Under normal circumstances, the sound would be lost in the general cacophony of war. But right now, in this particular pocket of the battlefield, where two apex predators have been stalking each other for 72 hours, that small sound might as well be a gunshot. Lyudmila sees the movement. Her muscles coil. Her finger tightens on the trigger. She doesn't rush the shot, doesn't let excitement override her training. She breathes, adjusts her aim by the smallest fraction, breathes again. The crosshairs settle exactly where they need to be. One move too many, she'll think later, when recounting this particular duel. He made one move too many. The Mosin Nagant kicks against her shoulder with its familiar, almost comforting recoil. The sharp crack of the gunshot echoes off the surrounding ruins, and 380 meters away, one of the Wehrmacht's finest snipers dies without ever seeing the woman who killed him. Lyudmila allows herself exactly 10 seconds to confirm the kill through her scope. Then she's moving, sliding back from her position, because staying in place after firing is suicide. Another basic rule of the sniper's craft: shoot and move, never ever remain static after you've revealed your position. Only later, after she's made her way back to Soviet lines, after she's reported the successful engagement, after she's cleaned her rifle and finally allowed herself to eat and drink something, will she reflect on what just happened. 3 days, 72 hours of the most intense psychological warfare imaginable, two highly trained killers locked in a duel where a single mistake meant death. And she won. She'll add another mark to her tally, another notch in her rifle's metaphorical stock, though the Soviet military doesn't do notches. They do confirmed kills witnessed by others, properly documented, officially recorded. This brings her total to 257, confirmed at this point in the war, a number that will eventually climb to 309 before a mortar round's shrapnel ends her time at the front. But who is this woman? How does a history student from Kiev become the deadliest female sniper in human history? What kind of person can lie motionless for 72 hours, engaged in a duel to the death with an enemy she's never met, and emerge victorious? What drives someone to accumulate a body count that would make hardened soldiers blanch? To understand Lyudmila Pavlichenko, to really comprehend the woman who would become Lady Death, we need to go back before the war, before the killing, before the fame, back to a small village in Ukraine, where a competitive tomboy was just beginning to discover that she was rather good at shooting things. The story begins, as so many stories do, with a child who refused to accept the limitations the world tried to place upon her. Lyudmila Mikhailovna Belova was born on July 12, 1916, in the small Ukrainian town of Bila Tserkva, which sits about 50 miles south of Kiev. If you've never heard of Bila Tserkva, you're not alone. It was then and remains today a modest-sized city, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where life moves at a measured pace, where the great events of history feel distant and abstract, problems for other people in other places. Her father, Mikhail Belov, worked as a factory laborer, the kind of hard, honest work that keeps the bones of civilization functioning, but rarely earns much recognition or reward. Before the revolution, he'd been a locksmith in St. Petersburg, one of those skilled tradesmen whose fingers could coax the most stubborn mechanisms into cooperation. Her mother, Eleanor Trofimovna Belova, taught in the local schools, instilling knowledge into young minds with the patience and dedication that characterizes the truly committed educator. The Belovs were not wealthy. They were not connected to power. They were not aristocrats clinging to the remnants of czarist privilege or revolutionary firebrands plotting the next phase of socialist transformation. They were simply ordinary Soviet citizens trying to build a decent life in the aftermath of revolution and civil war, in a country that was still figuring out what it wanted to be. But their daughter Lyudmila, she was anything but ordinary. From the very beginning, little Lyudmila demonstrated a fierce, competitive spirit that set her apart from her peers. While other girls played with dolls and practiced the domestic skills that Soviet society, for all its revolutionary rhetoric about gender equality, still expected women to master, Lyudmila wanted to run, to climb, to compete, to test herself against the boys in the neighborhood games. She was a tomboy in the truest sense of the word, someone who instinctively rejected the notion that certain activities or ambitions should be off limits based solely on her gender. Years later, when recounting her childhood, she would describe herself with characteristic bluntness, a self-described tomboy who was fiercely competitive at athletic activities. She refused, absolutely refused, to let the neighborhood boys outdo her at anything. If they could climb a tree, she could climb it faster. If they could run to the end of the street, she would beat them there. If they boasted about their achievements, she would quietly go out and exceed them, then come back with the proof. This competitive fire, this refusal to accept second place or to be limited by others' expectations, this would define her entire life. It was the spark that would eventually ignite into something far more deadly than anyone could have anticipated when watching that fierce little girl tear through the streets of Bila Tserkva, dirt on her knees and determination in her eyes. When Lyudmila was 14 years old, the Belov family made a decision that would change the trajectory of their daughter's life. They moved from Bila Tserkva to Kiev, the great capital of Ukraine, a city of gold-domed churches and wide boulevards, of universities and industry, of culture and opportunity. For a young woman with Lyudmila's drive and intelligence, Kiev opened up possibilities that would have remained forever out of reach in their small hometown. The Kiev that Lyudmila moved to in 1930 was a city in transition. The Soviet Union was in the midst of its first 5-year plan, Stalin's ambitious program to rapidly industrialize the country and transform it from a primarily agricultural society into a modern industrial power. Factories were springing up, churning out tractors and textiles, machinery and munitions. The city hummed with a sense of urgency, of transformation, of a nation determined to catch up with and surpass the capitalist West through sheer force of will and collective effort. And in the midst of this ferment, young Lyudmila found something that would capture her attention and focus her competitive instincts in an entirely new direction. She joined a shooting club. Now you might wonder why shooting clubs were such a common feature of Soviet life in the 1930s. The answer lies in the peculiar nature of Soviet society at the time. The leadership, paranoid about external threats and internal counter-revolutionaries, wanted a population that was not just politically indoctrinated, but also prepared for potential military service. This gave rise to organizations like Osoavyakim, the Society for Assistance to Defense and Aviation Chemical Development of the Soviet Union, which sounds like a bureaucratic mouthful because it absolutely was a bureaucratic mouthful. But beneath the unwieldy name was a practical purpose, teaching Soviet citizens, including women and girls, military-adjacent skills like shooting, parachuting, radio operation, and basic military discipline. The idea was that if war came, which Soviet leadership assumed it eventually would, because that's what leadership does, assume the worst, the entire population would already have a foundation of military skills to build upon. For someone like Lyudmila, who loved competition and excelled at anything requiring discipline, focus, and precision, the shooting club was a revelation. Here was an activity where her gender didn't matter, where all that mattered was whether she could hit the target. No one could argue with a bullet hole in the center of a bullseye. No one could claim she wasn't good enough when the evidence was right there on the paper for everyone to see. And it turned out that Lyudmila Belova had a natural gift for marksmanship. There's something almost meditative about target shooting. When you're good at it, the rest of the world falls away. The noise, the distractions, the doubts, everything just fades into background static. Your entire universe contracts to 3 things: you, the rifle, and the target. You control your breathing, slow and steady, because every heartbeat, every expansion and contraction of your lungs affects your aim. You learn to squeeze the trigger, not pull it, a gentle, progressive pressure that fires the weapon at exactly the moment you intend, not a fraction of a second early or late. You begin to understand windage and elevation, how distance and atmosphere affect the bullet's trajectory, turning marksmanship from a physical skill into a kind of applied mathematics. Lyudmila took to it immediately. She practiced obsessively, spending hours at the range, perfecting her technique, learning to read the conditions, developing that peculiar sense that good shooters have, an intuitive understanding of how to make the rifle an extension of their body rather than a separate tool they're trying to control. Her dedication paid off. She earned her Voroshilov sharpshooter badge, an honorary civil decoration named after Kliment Voroshilov, one of Stalin's cronies who served as the Soviet defense minister. More importantly, she earned a marksman certificate, official recognition of her shooting skills. These weren't just pieces of paper or bits of metal to pin on her chest. They were proof, tangible evidence that she was genuinely good at something that mattered, something that even the most dismissive person couldn't wave away. But Lyudmila's ambitions extended far beyond the shooting range. She was intellectually curious, hungry for knowledge, driven to make something of herself beyond what her working-class background might have predicted. During the day, she worked at the Kiev arsenal factory as a grinder, a job that was physically demanding and mind-numbingly repetitive, but provided the money she needed to support herself. At night, she attended school, determined to get the education that would open doors to a better future. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from working all day at a physically demanding job and then going to classes in the evening, trying to absorb complex information when your body is screaming for rest, taking notes with hands that are stiff and sore from hours of manual labor. But Lyudmila pushed through. She had that combination of ambition and discipline that separates people who dream from people who achieve. In 1932, at the age of 16, Lyudmila got married to a man named Alexei Pavlichenko. The marriage gave her the surname she would carry for the rest of her life and also produced a son, Rostislav, born that same year. But the marriage itself didn't last. The details of why are lost to history, the private pain and incompatibility that ended the union remaining exactly that, private. What we know is that it dissolved quickly, and Lyudmila returned to live with her parents, now a single mother at 16, working, studying, raising a child, and still finding time to practice her marksmanship. Think about that for a moment. 16 years old, a failed marriage behind her, a baby to care for, working full-time at a factory, attending school at night, and still driven enough, disciplined enough to continue honing her shooting skills because she knew somehow that they mattered, that they would be important, even if she couldn't yet see how. In 1937, Lyudmila achieved something that must have seemed like an impossible dream when she was grinding metal in the factory. She enrolled at Kiev University to study history. She wanted to be a scholar, a teacher, someone who helped others understand the great sweep of human events and the patterns that recurred throughout time. She specialized in the life of Bohdan Khmelnytsky, the 17th century Cossack hetman who led an uprising against Polish rule, a figure of towering importance in Ukrainian history. At university, Lyudmila continued to excel in multiple domains. She competed on the track team as a sprinter and pole vaulter, athletic pursuits that kept her in excellent physical condition. She continued her studies with the shooting club, now taking more advanced courses, learning not just basic marksmanship, but the specialized skills of sniping, the ability to make precise shots at long distances under combat conditions. Imagine her at this point in her life. Early 20s, a single mother successfully juggling parenthood with university studies, an accomplished athlete, a skilled marksman with training in sniping techniques, studying history, learning about the great conflicts and conquests that shaped nations, probably never imagining that she would soon find herself participating in one of the largest and most brutal conflicts in human history. She had no way of knowing, as she sat in those lecture halls in Kiev in the late 1930s, that within a few years she would be making history rather than studying it. She couldn't foresee that her competitive spirit and her shooting skills, things she had developed almost as hobbies, almost as ways to prove herself, would become instruments of survival and warfare. She had no inkling that she was about to become one of the most famous soldiers of World War II, a woman whose name would strike fear into the hearts of German troops and inspire admiration and respect across the Allied nations. But history, as Lyudmila would have learned in her studies, has a way of sweeping people up in its currents regardless of their plans or expectations. And the current that was about to sweep across Eastern Europe would be unlike anything the world had ever seen. The summer of 1941 started like any other for Lyudmila Pavlichenko. She was in her 4th year at Kiev University, deep into her history studies, probably working on papers about Khmelnytsky's campaigns or the complex dynamics of Cossack society in the 17th century. She was 24 years old. Her son Rostislav was 9. Life had settled into a rhythm, the comfortable routine of academia punctuated by athletic competitions and the ongoing practice of her marksmanship skills. Then, on June 22, 1941, at approximately 3:15 in the morning, that comfortable routine was obliterated along with much of the Soviet Union's western border defenses. Operation Barbarossa, the German code name for the invasion of the Soviet Union, was the largest military operation in human history up to that point. More than 3 million German soldiers, along with hundreds of thousands of troops from Germany's Romanian, Finnish, Hungarian, and Italian allies, came crashing across the border in a coordinated assault that stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, nearly 2,000 miles of front, all exploding into violence at essentially the same moment. The invasion was supposed to be, in Hitler's calculation, the swift coup de grâce that would bring the Soviet Union to its knees within weeks, months at the absolute outside. The Führer and his generals looked at the Red Army, still reeling from Stalin's purges that had decimated its officer corps, and saw an easy target. They looked at the political repression and economic disruption of Soviet society and assumed the whole rotten edifice would collapse with a few good kicks. They were catastrophically wrong, but that wouldn't become clear for some time. The assault began with a massive aerial bombardment. Luftwaffe aircraft struck Soviet air bases, catching much of the Red Air Force on the ground, destroying hundreds of planes before they could even take off. Simultaneously, German artillery opened up along the entire front, a thunderous barrage that shook the earth and announced to anyone still somehow unaware that war had arrived with terrible force. In Kiev, Lyudmila was walking to her morning classes when German fighters buzzed overhead, low and fast, the roar of their engines drowning out every other sound. The peaceful summer morning exploded into chaos. The aircraft strafed the streets, bullets chewing up pavement and building, sending civilians scrambling for cover. The unmistakable sound of anti-aircraft guns started up, a futile gesture against the waves of German planes that seemed to fill the sky. For Lyudmila, watching this, feeling the ground shake from bomb impacts, hearing the screams of the wounded and dying, something shifted fundamentally. The war she had studied as abstract history, analyzing campaigns and strategies from a safe academic distance, had suddenly become horrifyingly, viscerally real. This wasn't text on a page about Khmelnytsky's battles against the Polish Commonwealth. This was her city, her people, under attack. The response was immediate and almost instinctive. Lyudmila headed straight for the recruiting office in Odessa, where her unit would be formed. She wasn't waiting for official conscription or wondering whether women would be allowed to serve. She was volunteering, and she was determined to serve in a combat role, not in some support position where she would be safely away from the actual fighting. The scene at the recruiting office must have been chaotic. Thousands of young men and a smaller number of young women flooding in to volunteer, driven by patriotism, anger, fear, or some combination of the three. The recruiters were overwhelmed. trying to process this sudden influx of volunteers, while simultaneously trying to figure out how the hell they were going to equip and train them when the Red Army was already reeling from the German onslaught. When Lyudmila approached the registration desk and stated that she wanted to join the infantry as a combat soldier, the recruiter looked at her with something between amusement and dismissal. This was a young woman, educated, middle class, someone who should be thinking about nursing duties or administrative work, not about picking up a rifle and going to the front. He suggested she would be better suited as a nurse. Lyudmila refused. Flatly, categorically refused. She insisted on an infantry assignment. You can almost see the recruiter's expression, can't you? The kind of patronizing patience that men have historically directed at women who want to do things outside their supposedly proper sphere. The gentle condescension that says, "That's nice, dear, but why don't you let the men handle this?" Then Lyudmila dropped her Voroshilov sharpshooter badge and her marksman certificate on the desk. Not nursing credentials, not secretarial skills. Documentation showing she was a trained sniper with extensive marksmanship experience. The recruiter's expression changed. He looked at the documents, then at her, then back at the documents. He told her she was going to get her fingernails dirty. His way, perhaps, of warning her or testing her resolve. Did she really understand what she was signing up for? Did she grasp that war was not some romantic adventure, but rather filth and horror and death? Lyudmila's response to this isn't recorded, but she got her wish. She was accepted into the Red Army's 25th Rifle Division Azov. A sniper, she became one of approximately 2,000 female snipers who would serve in the Red Army during World War II. A number that sounds impressive until you realize that only about 500 of them would survive the war. 1 in 4. Those were the odds Lyudmila was facing, though she probably didn't know the statistics at the time and might not have cared if she had. The Soviet Union was unique among the major combatants in World War II for its large-scale deployment of women in direct combat roles. Other nations used women extensively in support functions, manufacturing, nursing, communications, but the Soviets put women in tanks, in aircraft, in sniper positions, places where they would kill and be killed. This wasn't primarily motivated by progressive ideals about gender equality, though Soviet propaganda certainly played that angle. It was born out of desperate necessity. The Red Army was hemorrhaging casualties at an appalling rate, and they needed everyone who could fight. Still, there was resistance. Many officers didn't want women in combat units, didn't believe they could handle the physical and psychological demands of warfare. Families tried to convince their daughters to stay home or take safer roles. The society that had theoretically embraced gender equality still harbored deep reservations about women as warriors. But for Lyudmila, this was not negotiable. She had made her decision. She was going to fight. There was just one small problem when she first arrived at her unit. Due to severe weapon shortages, a common problem for the Red Army in the early days of the war, when German advances had captured enormous amounts of Soviet equipment, Lyudmila wasn't immediately issued a rifle. Instead, she was given a single RGD-33 fragmentation grenade and assigned to dig trenches and communication routes. Think about how frustrating that must have been. You're a trained sniper who has volunteered to fight, who has overcome bureaucratic resistance to get a combat assignment, and then you spend your first weeks at the front digging ditches with nothing but a hand grenade for protection. Lyudmila later wrote in her memoirs that it was profoundly frustrating to observe the course of battle with just a single grenade in her hand, unable to actually contribute to the fighting in any meaningful way. Then, in late July, about a month after she had arrived at the front, a comrade was severely wounded by shrapnel. As he was being carried off for medical treatment, dying or close to it, he handed Lyudmila his rifle. A Mosin Nagant Model 1891 bolt-action rifle, the same weapon that had been in service in various configurations since the last days of the Tsarist Empire. Heavy, sturdy, reliable, accurate, exactly what a sniper needed. Finally, Lyudmila had the tools she needed to do her job. The question was whether she could actually do it when the moment came. Target shooting is one thing. Taking aim at a human being, someone's son or brother or father, and deliberately ending their life, that's something else entirely. Many people find they simply can't do it when confronted with the reality rather than the abstraction. They freeze, they hesitate, and in combat, that hesitation can get you and everyone around you killed. On August 8th, 1921, Lyudmila Pavlichenko killed her first enemy soldiers. 2 Romanian officers who were working with the German forces, collaborating in the invasion of the Soviet Union. They were approximately 400 meters away, well within her effective range. She took her time, controlled her breathing, settled the crosshairs, and fired. 1 shot, 1 kill. The first officer dropped. The second officer, perhaps not immediately understanding where the shot had come from, or perhaps frozen by shock or disbelief, didn't take cover quickly enough. Lyudmila worked the bolt, ejecting the spent cartridge and chambering a fresh round. She reacquired her target, adjusted for the slight change in position, fired again, 2 shots, 2 kills. The young woman who had spent her childhood competing with neighborhood boys, who had excelled at university athletics and academic studies, who had practiced her marksmanship as almost a hobby, had just killed 2 human beings in combat. And she had done it with the kind of cold, methodical precision that would become her trademark. When she reported back to her unit and confirmed the kills, her fellow soldiers' skepticism evaporated. They had been wary of this university-educated woman with her shooting certificates, wondering if she would actually be able to perform when things got real. Now they knew. She could shoot, and more importantly, she would shoot. Lyudmila later said that these first 2 kills were test shots and didn't count toward her official tally, but they marked the beginning of something that would define the rest of her life. She had crossed a threshold that can never be uncrossed. She was no longer Lyudmila Pavlichenko, history student. She was now Lyudmila Pavlichenko, sniper. And over the next 10 months, she would become very, very good at her job. The war had come to find her, and she had decided to fight back with everything she had. Odessa, that beautiful port city on the Black Sea, pearl of the Ukrainian coast, was about to become a charnel house. The city sits strategically on the northwestern shore of the Black Sea, a vital port that had served as a gateway for trade and naval operations for centuries. In 1941, it was home to roughly 600,000 people, a bustling cosmopolitan place where Ukrainian, Russian, Jewish, Greek, and a dozen other communities had created something vibrant and multicultural, a city that prided itself on its culture, its humor, its slightly irreverent attitude toward authority. The German and Romanian forces that advanced on Odessa in early August 1941 intended to capture it quickly and add it to the growing list of Soviet cities that had fallen in the first weeks of Operation Barbarossa. What they found instead was a city that absolutely refused to surrender. The defense of Odessa would last from August 5th to October 16th, 1941, 73 days of brutal, grinding combat. The Red Army's 25th, 95th, and 421st Rifle Divisions, along with the Odessa Naval Base and various militia units, dug in around the city, creating 3 defensive lines that the enemy would have to fight through. Behind them, the entire civilian population mobilized to support the defense. Men, women, and children dug anti-tank ditches, built fortifications, worked in factories producing ammunition and equipment, anything they could do to help hold the line. Lyudmila Pavlichenko arrived at this cauldron in early August as part of the 25th Rifle Division's No. 2 Company. Her unit was assigned to the center of the first defensive line, right in the path of the main enemy assault. This wasn't some quiet sector where she could ease into combat gradually. She was being thrown directly into the deep end. The German offensive began on August 8th with thunderous artillery barrages that shook the earth and lit the sky with fire. Shells screamed overhead before impacting with devastating force, throwing up fountains of dirt and debris, turning the landscape into a cratered moonscape. The sound was overwhelming, a physical assault on the senses that made thinking almost impossible. And then, the infantry came. Lyudmila's first day in combat was supposed to be the day she proved herself, the day she showed that all her training and all her natural talent translated into actual combat performance. Instead, it almost ended before it began. She and another soldier from her company were positioned overlooking a narrow field. Across the way, a number of enemy soldiers were moving about, easy targets by any reasonable standard. Lyudmila raised her rifle, settled into her firing position, controlled her breathing, placed the crosshairs on an enemy soldier, and prepared to fire. And her finger froze on the trigger. This is the moment they don't talk about much in war movies or heroic narratives. The moment when the theoretical becomes real, when you're faced with the concrete reality of taking another human being's life, not in abstract terms, but right there in front of you, a living person who will stop being alive because you pull a trigger. Lyudmila had killed those 2 Romanian officers, yes, but that had been at a distance, almost impersonal. This was different. She could see them clearly through her scope, could make out individual features and mannerisms. Maybe she was thinking about the young German or Romanian soldier in her crosshairs. Maybe she was wondering if he had a family waiting for him back home, if he was someone's son or brother or husband. Maybe she was just experiencing the perfectly natural human reluctance to kill that most people feel when confronted with it for the first time. Whatever the reason, she hesitated. And then the young Russian soldier who had positioned himself next to her, perhaps another member of her company, who had taken it upon himself to mentor or protect the new female recruit, was hit. The sharp crack of an enemy rifle, the wet impact of a bullet striking flesh, and suddenly there was blood, and the young man who had been alive and breathing a moment before was dead or dying beside her. Lyudmila later said that he was such a nice, happy boy, one of those genuinely good-natured souls that you sometimes encounter even in the worst circumstances. The kind of person who brightens the mood just by being present. And now he was dead, killed by the same enemy soldiers she had been hesitating to shoot. After that, nothing could stop her. The hesitation evaporated, burned away by anger and grief and the stark realization that this was kill or be killed, that mercy and compassion were luxuries that got you and your comrades killed. She began firing with cold, methodical efficiency, working the bolt, acquiring targets, squeezing the trigger, working the bolt again. 2 enemy soldiers fell that day to her shots, the first of many. Over the next 2.5 months, as the battle for Odessa raged, Lyudmila settled into the grim routine of combat sniping. She would leave camp in the early morning, before dawn, moving carefully through the Soviet defensive lines to advanced positions close to the enemy. She'd find a concealed spot, somewhere with good sight lines and decent cover, and then she'd wait. Sometimes she'd wait there for 15, 18, even 20 hours at a stretch, barely moving, controlling even her bladder and bowel functions through sheer discipline, because leaving your position for any reason could mean missing a shot or being killed by an enemy sniper who had been patiently waiting for you to reveal yourself. The physical demands of this kind of sniping are immense. Lying in the same position for 18 hours straight goes beyond uncomfortable into the realm of genuine physical torture. Your muscles cramp, your joints stiffen, your back screams in protest. Every part of your body wants desperately to move, to shift, to find relief. But you can't, because movement means death. The mental demands are even greater. You have to maintain focus and alertness for impossible lengths of time, watching for opportunities that might come only once or twice during an entire day. You have to stay calm and controlled even when artillery is landing nearby, even when you can hear the screams of the wounded, even when everything inside you wants to panic and run. You have to make split-second calculations about windage and distance and trajectory, and you have to be right every time because you typically only get one shot before you have to relocate. But Lyudmila was discovering that she was remarkably good at all of it. The patience she had learned as a child competing in athletics served her well. The discipline she had developed through her academic work helped her stay focused. The natural competitive fire that had driven her all her life now channeled itself into the grim competition of war, where the prize for winning was survival and the penalty for losing was death. She began to accumulate kills at a steady rate. 3 here, 5 there, 2 more the next day, each one witnessed and confirmed by other soldiers, properly documented according to Red Army procedures. The tally climbed. 10, 20, 50, 100. By the end of August, when she had been at the front for just over 3 weeks, she hit 100 confirmed kills and was promoted to senior sergeant. Among those 187 kills she accumulated during the siege of Odessa, the vast majority were ordinary infantrymen, but she also began targeting officers and specialists, a captain coordinating an assault, a forward observer calling in artillery strikes, machine gunners who were pinning down Soviet positions. These were high-value targets whose deaths had outsized effects on enemy operations. Kill a private and you've removed 1 rifle from the field. Kill a captain and you've removed the person coordinating an entire company's movements. During this period, Lyudmila also got married for a second time to a fellow sniper named Alexei Kitsenko. In the midst of horror and death, they found something worth holding on to, some brief moments of connection and humanity. But war is capricious and cruel, and it doesn't care about love or plans or the small happinesses people manage to carve out for themselves in the spaces between violence. Soon after the marriage, Kitsenko was hit by a mortar shell and died from his injuries a few days later in a field hospital. Lyudmila had now lost a young comrade who had positioned himself next to her on her first day, and she had lost her husband. These deaths, along with the 187 enemy soldiers she had killed, began to accumulate in her psyche like sediment at the bottom of a river. Layer upon layer of trauma and loss that would eventually take their toll. But at the time, there was no opportunity to process grief or trauma. There was only the next mission, the next target, the next day of survival. The siege continued, and so did she. By October, the situation in Odessa had become untenable. The city had held out far longer than anyone expected, tying down Romanian and German forces that were needed elsewhere, but it couldn't hold indefinitely. The defenders were running low on ammunition and supplies. Casualties had been severe. The strategic situation demanded that Soviet forces withdraw and redeploy to more defensible positions. On October 15th and 16th, under cover of darkness, the Red Army executed a masterful evacuation. Using ships from the Black Sea Fleet, they pulled the surviving defenders out of Odessa and transported them to Sevastopol on the Crimean Peninsula, about 300 miles to the east. The enemy, who had expected to finally crush the Odessa garrison after months of grinding combat, woke up to find their opponents gone, evacuated to fight another day. Lyudmila Pavlichenko boarded one of those evacuation ships with 187 confirmed kills to her name, a promotion to senior sergeant, and the hard-won knowledge that she could not only function in combat but excel at it. She had proven herself to her fellow soldiers and to herself. She had no way of knowing that the battle she had just survived would seem almost easy compared to what was waiting for her on the Crimean Peninsula. Sevastopol would make Odessa look like a warm-up exercise. Sevastopol sits at the southwestern tip of the Crimean Peninsula, commanding the approaches to the Black Sea. It had been a fortress city since the mid-19th century, its strategic importance recognized by everyone who ever looked at a map of the region. During the Crimean War in the 1850s, British, French, and Ottoman forces had besieged it for nearly a year before finally taking it from the Russians. In World War I, German forces had captured it, and now, in World War II, the Germans were coming for it again. When Lyudmila and the remnants of the Odessa garrison arrived in late October 1941, Sevastopol was already preparing for a siege that everyone knew was coming. The city's position was both a blessing and a curse. Yes, it could be resupplied by sea as long as the Black Sea Fleet maintained some measure of control over the waters. But it was also essentially a peninsula at the end of a peninsula, a place that could be cut off and isolated, where defenders would have their backs to the sea with nowhere to retreat. The German and Romanian forces that advanced on Sevastopol in November 1941 expected a difficult fight, but a fairly quick one. They had steamrolled across much of the Soviet Union in the previous months. They had captured hundreds of thousands of prisoners. They had taken city after city, often in battles that lasted only days or weeks. Sevastopol, they assumed, would fall by the end of the year. It took them 8 months. 8 months of the most brutal, grinding, attritional warfare that the Eastern Front had yet seen. And when the city finally did fall in July 1942, it was only after the defenders had inflicted casualties that horrified even the hardened German forces. For Lyudmila Pavlichenko, those 8 months would be both the pinnacle of her combat career and the period that would eventually end it. She would accumulate the majority of her 309 total kills in Sevastopol. She would be promoted twice. She would train other snipers. She would engage in numerous deadly duels with enemy snipers, including that famous 3-day engagement we opened with. And she would be wounded 4 separate times before finally being evacuated. The German assault began in November 1941. With a sustained artillery bombardment that turned sections of the city into rubble. The Luftwaffe pounded the defenses day after day, dropping thousands of tons of high explosive. German and Romanian infantry pushed forward, trying to break through the defensive lines, only to be thrown back by determined Soviet resistance. The fighting quickly devolved into a nightmare of urban combat, trench warfare, and attrition. Sniper warfare became one of the defining characteristics of the battle. Both sides deployed their best marksmen, turning the ruined city into a deadly game of hide and seek where the slightest mistake could prove fatal. Lyudmila thrived in this environment, though thrived seems like an obscene word to use for someone operating in conditions of such horror. But professionally, as a sniper, this was her element. The ruined buildings provided countless concealment positions. The static nature of much of the fighting meant she could carefully plan her shots. The presence of numerous enemy snipers meant there were high-value targets to hunt. She developed a methodical approach to her work. Early morning, before the sun came up, she'd move to a carefully selected position. She'd study the ground ahead of her, memorizing every pile of rubble, every crater, every piece of debris. She'd identify likely positions where enemy snipers might set up. She'd watch for patterns in enemy movement, learning when soldiers tended to be most exposed. And then she'd wait, sometimes for the entire day, for the perfect shot to present itself. Her patience was legendary. Fellow soldiers marveled at her ability to lie absolutely motionless for 15, 18, 20 hours at a stretch. She later wrote about this aspect of sniping, describing how you need great self-control, willpower, and endurance to remain in position for such lengths of time without moving. The slightest twitch, she noted, could mean death. The psychological warfare aspect of sniping also escalated during the Sevastopol siege. The Germans knew about Lyudmila Pavlichenko. As her kill count climbed toward 200 and beyond, as reports filtered back about this devastatingly effective female Soviet sniper, She became both a propaganda problem and a priority target. The Germans began broadcasting messages to her over loudspeakers, trying to convince her to defect. Lyudmila Pavlichenko, the messages would boom across no man's land in Russian, "Come over to us. We will give you plenty of chocolate and make you a German officer." Chocolate and a promotion. That was the bribe they offered to a woman who had already killed hundreds of their soldiers. One imagines Lyudmila, hidden in some rubble pile, listening to these messages and thinking about how little they understood her or what motivated her. Did they really think she was fighting for chocolate? That she'd betray her country and her dead comrades for the promise of a better position in the Wehrmacht? When the bribes didn't work, the Germans switched to threats. Near the end of her time at Sevastopol, the messages became more direct and more savage. "If we catch you, we will tear you into 309 pieces and scatter them to the winds." Lyudmila later said she was actually happy to hear this threat because it meant the Germans had her tally exactly right. They knew her record. They understood how much damage she was doing. The fact that they were threatening her specifically meant she was doing her job well enough to make the enemy afraid. But it wasn't just the Germans who were trying to kill her. The dangerous counter-sniper assignments she began accepting put her in direct competition with other highly trained snipers, men who were just as patient, just as skilled, and just as determined to survive as she was. Counter-sniping is perhaps the most psychologically intense form of warfare that exists. You're not hunting infantry who might stumble into your crosshairs. You're hunting someone who is hunting you. Someone who knows all the same tricks you know, someone who is actively trying to outwit and kill you. It becomes a game of chess played with rifles and bullets, where a single mistake costs you your life. Lyudmila engaged in 36 of these deadly duels during her time in combat. 36 times she went up against enemy snipers, and 36 times she won. This statistic is almost too extraordinary to comprehend. Every single time she entered into this most dangerous form of combat, she emerged alive while her opponent did not. One of these duels, the one we discussed at the beginning of this video, lasted 3 full days. 3 days of stalking each other through the ruins, of feints and deceptions, of trying to draw the other into making a mistake. 3 days of barely eating or drinking, of staying motionless for hours on end, of the most intense psychological pressure imaginable. Lyudmila later described it as one of the tensest experiences of her life, which is saying something considering what she'd been through. For 3 days, her entire world contracted down to finding and killing one specific enemy sniper before he found and killed her. Both of them were highly trained. Both were experienced. Both had survived numerous engagements. But in the end, her opponent made one move too many, as she put it. A tiny mistake, probably barely perceptible to anyone not engaged in that particular duel, but enough. He moved when he should have stayed still, or moved in a way that gave away his position, and Lyudmila's bullet found him. But combat sniping wasn't all Lyudmila did during the Sevastopol siege. She also trained other snipers, passing on her hard-won knowledge and techniques to newcomers who desperately needed any advantage they could get to survive. Her trainees were credited with killing over 100 enemy soldiers during the battle, extending her effect far beyond her personal tally. Think about what this means. She's actively hunting enemy soldiers herself, racking up kills at a steady pace. She's engaging in these extraordinarily dangerous counter-sniper duels, and she's also teaching others how to be effective snipers. All of this while under constant artillery fire, frequent aerial bombardment with minimal food and sleep, in conditions that broke many men who were supposed to be hardened warriors. By May 1942, Lyudmila's confirmed kill count had reached 257. She was cited by the Southern Army Council for this achievement and promoted to lieutenant. The number itself is staggering. In roughly 9 months of combat, she had killed 257 enemy soldiers. That's averaging about 28 kills per month, nearly 1 per day, though the reality was probably more sporadic, with days of patient waiting punctuated by moments of intense action. The physical and mental toll was accumulating. She had been wounded 4 separate times by this point, though none of the wounds had been severe enough to get her evacuated. Shrapnel from artillery and mortar fire had scarred her body. The psychological weight of killing 2 human beings, no matter how justified by the circumstances of war, was settling into her soul like a stone. The deaths of comrades, the constant proximity to violence, the ever-present possibility that the next second might be your last, all of it was grinding away at her. Then, in June 1942, a mortar round exploded near her position. The shell didn't hit her directly, which almost certainly would have killed her outright, but shrapnel from the blast struck her in the face. The wounds were serious enough that she needed immediate medical attention and couldn't remain in combat. Under normal circumstances, Lyudmila would have been patched up, given some time to recover, and sent back to the front. Snipers were valuable, and she was one of the best. But by this point, Soviet High Command had recognized that Lyudmila Pavlichenko was more than just a sniper. She was a symbol. She was propaganda gold. A young, educated woman who had killed 309 enemy soldiers, her tally had climbed in those final weeks, made for a much better story than yet another male soldier doing his duty. So the order came down: evacuate Lyudmila Pavlichenko from Sevastopol. Get her to safety. She's too valuable to risk losing. The evacuation itself was dramatic. Sevastopol was under siege, surrounded by enemy forces. The only way out was by sea, and even that was dangerous given German control of the air and the presence of Axis naval forces in the area. Lyudmila was transported to a submarine, one of the vessels that was running supplies and personnel in and out of the besieged city, and evacuated to Novorossiysk on the mainland. From there, she was sent to Moscow for medical treatment and recovery. She spent about a month in a hospital, recovering from her facial wounds and probably from sheer exhaustion. And while she was recovering, Soviet leadership was deciding what to do with their most successful female sniper. The decision was that Lyudmila Pavlichenko's war at the front was over. She had done enough. She had proven her courage and skill beyond any doubt. Now she would serve the Soviet Union in a different capacity. She would become MP, spokesperson, a propagandist, a symbol of Soviet determination and capability. Some part of her must have been relieved. Combat sniping is not sustainable as a long-term career. The odds catch up with everyone, eventually. Of the 2,000 female snipers who served in the Red Army, only 500 survived the war. Lyudmila had already beaten those odds by lasting as long as she had. Getting out while she was still alive was, objectively, a victory, but another part of her must have felt guilty, conflicted, as if she were abandoning her comrades who were still fighting and dying in Sevastopol. The city would fall in July 1942, just weeks after her evacuation, after 8 months of siege. Many of the people she had fought alongside, trained, shared meals with, wouldn't make it out. They would die defending the city or be captured by the Germans, which was often worse. Lyudmila Pavlichenko's combat career had lasted approximately 10 months, from late July 1941 to June 1942. In that time, she had killed 309 confirmed enemy soldiers, including 36 snipers. She had been wounded 4 times. She had fought in 2 of the most brutal sieges on the Eastern Front. She had proven that women could not only fight as effectively as men, but, in some roles, potentially more effectively. And now, whether she wanted it or not, she was going to become famous. To really understand what made Lyudmila Pavlichenko so effective, we need to dive into the specific techniques, equipment, and mindset that define excellent sniping. This isn't just about being able to shoot accurately, though that's obviously fundamental. It's about an entire complex of skills and attributes that most people don't possess and couldn't develop even with extensive training. Let's start with the weapon itself, the Mosin Nagant rifle that Lyudmila carried through 10 months of combat. The Mosin Nagant model 8091-30 has an interesting history. The base design dates back to 1891, when it was adopted by the Tsarist Russian army after a competition between various rifle designs. The weapon combined elements from Sergei Mosin's Russian design with some features from the Belgian Nagant brothers' design, hence the hyphenated name. By World War II, the rifle was old, but it was reliable, accurate, and simple to maintain, qualities that matter far more in war than being cutting edge. The version used during the war was the model 1891-30, a modernized variant that incorporated metric sights instead of the old Imperial Russian measurement system and featured a round receiver instead of the earlier hexagonal design. For sniper use, these rifles were specially selected. Not every Mosin Nagant was accurate enough to serve as a sniper rifle. Soviet gunsmiths would test batches of rifles, identifying those that demonstrated superior accuracy, and those would be set aside for conversion to sniper use. The conversion process involved several modifications. The bolt handle was lengthened and bent downward, so it wouldn't interfere with the scope when the shooter worked the action. The trigger pull was lightened to somewhere between 4.4 and 5.3 pounds, making it easier to fire the weapon without disturbing your aim. The front sight was raised by about 1 millimeter. The most important addition was the scope itself. Early in the war, Soviet snipers used the PE or PM scope, a 4-power telescopic sight that was a Soviet-made copy of a German Zeiss design. These were good scopes, but relatively complex and expensive to produce. By 1942, around the time Lyudmila was evacuated from Sevastopol, the Soviets had switched to the simpler PU scope, a 3.5 power fixed focus design that was easier to manufacture and more rugged in the field. The rifle fired the 7.4mm rimmed cartridge, a round that's roughly comparable in power to the American 30-06. It's a full-powered rifle cartridge with excellent range and stopping power. A skilled sniper with a Mosin Nagant and good ammunition could reliably hit targets out to 400 meters and could make shots at 600 meters or more under ideal conditions. But here's the thing about sniping. The rifle and the scope are just tools. Having a quality weapon doesn't make you a quality sniper any more than having a quality violin makes you a quality violinist. The skills, the discipline, the mindset, those are what matter. Lyudmila had to master a complex array of abilities. First, pure marksmanship fundamentals, breath control, trigger squeeze, sight alignment, follow through. These basics have to become so ingrained that they're automatic, reflexive, something you do correctly even under stress without having to think about them consciously. Then there's the more advanced skills specific to long-range shooting. You have to learn to judge distances accurately because the trajectory of a bullet curves significantly over hundreds of meters. A shot that's perfectly aimed at 200 meters will miss high at 150 or low at 300. You have to account for wind, which pushes the bullet off course in ways that vary depending on the distance, the wind speed and direction, even the ambient temperature and air pressure. You have to understand how different types of ammunition perform, how the rifle's point of impact shifts as the barrel heats up from firing multiple shots. And beyond the pure shooting skills, there's fieldcraft. The ability to move through terrain without being detected. The skills to build or find concealment that doesn't look obviously artificial. Understanding how to use natural features for cover and camouflage. Knowing how to observe and identify targets at long distances, distinguishing between a stick and a rifle barrel, between a shadow and a helmet. Patience might be the most critical attribute. Lyudmila talked about this extensively in her memoirs and interviews. You might spend 15, 18, 20 hours lying in position, waiting for a single good shot. Your entire body aches. You're hungry, thirsty, desperately need to urinate. Flies crawl on your face, the sun beats down, or rain soaks through your clothing, or you're freezing in winter cold. And through all of this, you have to maintain your focus, stay alert, Be ready to take that shot with perfect precision when the opportunity finally appears. The psychological demands are even more intense. You're making conscious, deliberate decisions to end human lives. Unlike an artillery gunner or a bomber pilot who might never see the individuals they kill, a sniper looks at their target through a magnified optic. You see faces, mannerisms, individual characteristics. You watch someone have a conversation with a friend, or light a cigarette, or read a letter from home, and then you shoot them and watch them die. This takes a toll. No matter how justified by military necessity, no matter how much you believe in your cause, killing people in this intimate, personal way leaves marks on your psyche. Many snipers develop various coping mechanisms or philosophies to deal with this. Some depersonalize their targets, refusing to think of them as individuals. Some convince themselves they're not killing people, but rather removing threats to their comrades. Some embrace a kind of hunter's mindset, treating it as a skill challenge divorced from the moral implications. Lyudmila seems to have adopted elements of this last approach. She talked about feeling the satisfaction a hunter feels after killing a beast of prey. This kind of language helped her maintain the psychological distance necessary to continue functioning, but it's also obvious from her later struggles with PTSD that the psychological cost was real and substantial. The counter-sniper duels added another layer of intensity. When you're hunting an enemy sniper, you're not looking for some random soldier who might wander into your field of fire. You're hunting someone specific who is trying equally hard to hunt you. It becomes incredibly personal, a contest of skills and nerves where the slightest mistake is fatal. These duels required an almost supernatural level of patience and discipline. You might detect the faintest sign of your opponent's presence, a shadow that seems slightly wrong, a piece of debris that looks artificially positioned, a glint that might be a scope, and then you have to watch that spot for hours, barely breathing, waiting to see if your suspicion is correct, waiting for them to make a mistake, while knowing they're probably doing exactly the same thing, watching some suspected position of yours, waiting for you to make a mistake. Lyudmila also developed specific tactics for drawing out enemy soldiers and snipers. She used decoys, mannequins dressed in Soviet uniforms, and positioned where enemy snipers might take a shot at them. She used brightly colored pieces of cloth placed strategically to attract attention and draw fire, revealing enemy positions. She worked in pairs or small teams when possible, with one person spotting and the other shooting, providing mutual security and support. The 3-day duel that we discussed earlier exemplifies all of these skills coming together. For 72 hours, Lyudmila maintained her discipline, stayed hidden, waited for her opponent to make a mistake, and when he finally did, she made the shot that mattered. The mental fortitude required for this is almost beyond comprehension. It's worth noting that Lyudmila also had to function as a female soldier in a military and society that had complicated attitudes about women in combat. Soviet propaganda celebrated female warriors as symbols of socialist equality, but actual attitudes on the ground were often more ambiguous. Some male soldiers respected female snipers and fighters, treating them as equals. Others were skeptical, condescending, or actively hostile. The simple logistics of being a woman in military uniform created additional challenges, from the basic fact that uniforms weren't designed for female bodies to the lack of separate facilities for hygiene and privacy. Lyudmila had to navigate all of this while also doing a job that would be psychologically and physically demanding for anyone. She had to prove herself again and again, knowing that any mistake or failure would be attributed not just to her as an individual, but to women in general. The pressure must have been immense, and yet she accumulated 309 confirmed kills, made it through 10 months of combat, survived 4 wounds, won 36 counter-sniper duels, and trained numerous other snipers who themselves went on to be effective. By any reasonable measure, she was one of the most effective soldiers the Red Army deployed during World War II, regardless of gender. The toll, however, was real. The woman who was evacuated from Sevastopol in June 1942 was not the same person who had enthusiastically volunteered for combat in August 1941. How could she be? She had seen things no human should have to see, done things that would haunt her dreams for the rest of her life, lost people she cared about, and lived for months under conditions of constant stress and danger that would break most people. And now, Soviet leadership wanted her to do something arguably even more difficult than combat. They wanted her to go to America, a country whose people had no direct experience of the kind of total war that was consuming the Soviet Union, and convince them to do more to help. They wanted her to be inspiring and articulate and diplomatic, to represent the Soviet war effort to a skeptical audience that had its own very particular ideas about what women should and shouldn't do. Lyudmila Pavlichenko had proven she could be a warrior. Now she would have to prove she could be a diplomat. And diplomacy, as she would discover, came with its own unique set of challenges and frustrations. In late September 1942, Lyudmila Pavlichenko stepped off a train in Washington, D.C. into what must have felt like an entirely different world. She had spent the previous year and change in the most brutal combat conditions imaginable. She had lived in trenches and ruins, gone days without proper food or sleep, been under near constant artillery fire, watched friends die, killed hundreds of enemy soldiers herself. The war on the Eastern Front was total, all-consuming, the kind of existential struggle where civilians were being slaughtered by the millions, where cities were being reduced to rubble, where the stakes couldn't possibly be higher. Now she was in America's capital, a city that seemed impossibly clean and prosperous and safe. There were no bomb craters here, no artillery rumbling in the distance, no smell of death hanging in the air. The streets were intact, the buildings were undamaged. People went about their daily lives without fear of sudden death raining down from above. To someone coming directly from Sevastopol, it must have seemed almost surreal. Lyudmila was part of a 3-person Soviet delegation that had been sent to the United States at the invitation of President Franklin Roosevelt. The delegation also included Nikolai Krasavchenko, a young communist leader, and Vladimir Pchelintsev, another sniper. But Lyudmila was clearly the star, the one everyone wanted to see and hear about. A young female Soviet sniper with 309 confirmed kills made for a much better story than yet another male soldier, even one with an impressive combat record. The Soviet Union's purpose in sending this delegation was transparently obvious. Stalin desperately wanted the Western Allies to open a second front in Europe. The Red Army was bearing the overwhelming majority of the burden in fighting Germany. Soviet casualties were mounting into the millions. Soviet territory was being systematically devastated. Every day that the Americans and British delayed opening a second front in Western Europe was another day that German forces could focus almost exclusively on the Eastern Front. So the Soviets sent Lyudmila and her fellow delegates to make the case directly to the American people. Look, they were saying, even our young women are fighting and dying on the front lines. This is how desperate the situation is. This is how total our commitment is to defeating fascism. Can't you do more to help? Lyudmila's first stop was the White House, where she became the first Soviet citizen to be received by a sitting US president. Franklin Roosevelt welcomed her warmly, though one suspects he was more interested in her propaganda value than in her personally. Still, the meeting went well enough, and more importantly, Eleanor Roosevelt took an immediate interest in the young Soviet sniper. Eleanor Roosevelt was a fascinating figure in her own right. The First Lady was far more than just the president's wife. She was a political force, an advocate for civil rights and social justice, someone who used her platform to push for causes she believed in, often over her husband's objections. And in Lyudmila Pavlichenko, she saw someone extraordinary, a young woman who had not only entered a male-dominated field, but had excelled in it beyond almost anyone's ability, proving that women could do things society insisted they couldn't or shouldn't do. The two women formed an unlikely but genuine friendship. Eleanor was nearly 60, a child of privilege and political connections who had never fired a weapon in anger. Lyudmila was 26, a working-class Ukrainian who had killed hundreds of men in combat. They came from radically different worlds, held different political beliefs, and spoke different languages. But they connected on a human level, and that connection would endure for the rest of Lyudmila's life. Eleanor invited Lyudmila to tour the United States with her, visiting various cities, giving speeches, meeting with workers and students, telling Americans about her experiences at the front. Lyudmila accepted, though she must have had reservations. She didn't speak English, she was shy by nature, and she was being asked to essentially be a performing monkey, trotted out to tell war stories for people who couldn't possibly understand what she had been through. The tour started badly and got worse before it got better. The American press, which met Lyudmila shortly after her arrival, focused on all the wrong things. Or rather, they focused on exactly what you'd expect a sexist press corps in 1942 to focus on when confronted with a female soldier. They asked about her appearance, her clothing, her makeup. They commented on her uniform, noting that it made her look fat. They questioned whether Soviet female soldiers were allowed to wear lipstick or nail polish. They wanted to know about her step-ins, a rather dated term for underwear. Lyudmila was baffled and increasingly angry. She had come to talk about the war, about the desperate situation on the Eastern Front, about the need for a second front. And these reporters wanted to discuss her skirt length and whether she curled her hair. In one memorable response, she let her frustration show. "I am amazed at the kind of questions put to me by the women press correspondents in Washington. Don't they know there is a war? They asked me silly questions such as, do I use powder and rouge and nail polish, and do I curl my hair?" One reporter even criticized the length of the skirt of my uniform, saying that in America women wear shorter skirts, and besides my uniform, made me look fat. This made me angry. I wear my uniform with honor. It has the Order of Lenin on it. It has been covered with blood in battle. It is plain to see that with American women, what is important is whether they wear silk underwear under their uniforms. What the uniform stands for, they have yet to learn. This is not the response of a trained diplomat carefully navigating cultural differences. This is the response of someone who had been through hell and couldn't believe that these comfortable, safe people wanted to talk about fashion and makeup while her country was bleeding to death. You can feel her contempt and frustration practically radiating off the page. But as the tour continued, Lyudmila began to find her voice and her audience. When she spoke to workers in factories, to students in universities, to ordinary Americans who were genuinely interested in understanding the war, she connected. She told them about what she had seen and done, about the scale of the German invasion, about the desperate need for help. In Chicago, she gave a speech that included one of her most famous lines, "Gentlemen, I am 25 years old, and I have killed 309 fascist invaders by now. Don't you think, gentlemen, that you have been hiding behind my back for too long?" The audience apparently loved it. It was direct, unvarnished criticism from someone who had earned the right to deliver it. She wasn't asking politely for help. She was telling them, with the authority of someone who had fought and bled and killed for 10 months straight, that they needed to do more. The tour took Lyudmila to 43 American cities over several months. She visited factories where workers were producing weapons and equipment. She spoke at universities and public gatherings. She met with labor leaders and politicians. And slowly, grudgingly, she began to appreciate that some Americans genuinely understood and cared about the Soviet struggle, even if many others seemed oblivious or indifferent. Eleanor Roosevelt proved to be a true friend during this tour. She helped Lyudmila navigate the complexities of American culture and press relations. She defended her when criticism came. She invited Lyudmila to Hyde Park, the Roosevelt family estate in New York, where they spent time together away from the public eye. In a particularly touching moment, Eleanor altered a set of her own pajamas to fit Lyudmila. and when doing so, she saw the long, forked scars on Lyudmila's back from shrapnel wounds. The sight moved Eleanor deeply. Here was physical evidence of what this young woman had endured. Eleanor hugged Lyudmila and kissed her forehead, saying, "What dreadful ordeals you've had to endure." It was one of those moments of genuine human connection that transcend politics and nationality and language. Two women from incomprehensibly different backgrounds, united by mutual respect and compassion. The tour also took Lyudmila to Canada and Britain. In Canada, she received symbolic gifts including a Winchester Model 70 rifle. In Britain, she visited Coventry, a city that had been devastated by German bombing, and saw firsthand that the British people did understand something about the costs of war. She toured factories and accepted donations from British workers to help pay for medical equipment for the Red Army. In Coventry alone, workers donated over £4,500, a substantial sum in 1942, to pay for 3 X-ray units. But throughout the tour, Lyudmila struggled. She was suffering from what we would now recognize as PTSD, though that diagnosis didn't really exist in 1942. She had nightmares. She was hypervigilant. Crowds made her anxious. She missed her comrades at the front. She felt guilty for being safe while they were still fighting and dying. The role of propagandist and symbol didn't sit well with her. She was a soldier, not a performer. And yet, she persevered. She gave the speeches, met the people, told her story again and again. Whether her tour actually moved the needle on American public opinion or policy is debatable. The Second Front wouldn't open until June 1944, 2 years after her visit. But she did raise awareness, did put a human face on the Soviet war effort, did demonstrate to Americans that Soviet women were fighting and dying alongside their men. By the time she returned to the Soviet Union in early 1943, she had been promoted to major and awarded the Gold Star of the Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest military decoration in the country. She had also received the Order of Lenin twice. These honors recognized not just her combat achievements, but also her service as a representative of the Soviet Union abroad. But they couldn't erase the toll the war had already taken on her. Lyudmila Pavlichenko was 26 years old. She had killed 309 men. She had been wounded 4 times. She had lost her second husband and numerous friends. She had spent months under conditions that would break most people. And now she was famous, a symbol, a hero, when all she had wanted was to do her duty and survive. The war would continue for another 2 years, but Lyudmila's combat role in it was over. She would spend the rest of the conflict training other snipers, passing on her hard-won skills and experience to the next generation of Red Army marksmen. She was good at it, effective, able to translate her practical knowledge into lessons that kept her students alive longer than they might have lived otherwise. But you have to wonder if part of her didn't miss the front, didn't miss the terrible simplicity of combat where everything was clear and immediate and the rules were simple. Kill the enemy before they kill you. Civilian life, peacetime life, even in the midst of war, was more complicated, more ambiguous. The pain and trauma had nowhere to go, no immediate survival-focused purpose to consume them. Lyudmila Pavlichenko had survived the war, at least the combat portion of it. But in many ways, the war was far from over for her. The real battle, the fight to live with what she had seen and done, was just beginning. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, with Germany's unconditional surrender. For Lyudmila Pavlichenko, by then 28 years old, the end of the fighting must have brought complicated emotions. Relief, certainly. The danger was over. The killing could stop. But also a kind of emptiness. What do you do when the thing that has defined your life for 4 years suddenly ends? How do you transition back to civilian existence when you've spent your formative adult years in combat? Lyudmila returned to Kiev University to complete her education. She had been a history student before the war, and now she resumed those studies, eventually earning her degree with a specialization in, appropriately enough, Bogdan Khmelnytsky, the 17th century Cossack leader. The university probably felt surreal to her. She had been here before, in what felt like a different lifetime, when she was a young woman with normal concerns and ambitions. Now she was a decorated war hero, someone who had killed hundreds of men, someone famous throughout the Soviet Union. How do you sit in a lecture hall and take notes on historical methodology when you've lived through history in its most violent form? But she persevered. She earned her degree and began working as a historian, first as a research assistant at the headquarters of the Soviet Navy from 1945 to 1953, and later in various academic and historical positions. On paper, it was exactly the career she had wanted before the war. She was an educated professional, using her intellect, contributing to Soviet society in a respectable, prestigious way. But the shadows of those 10 months in combat were long and dark. Lyudmila struggled with PTSD, though again, that specific diagnosis and understanding of combat trauma was not well developed at the time, especially in the Soviet Union, where psychological problems were often dismissed as weakness or bourgeois self-indulgence. She had nightmares, flashbacks, periods of deep depression. She turned to alcohol to self-medicate, a common response for combat veterans trying to quiet the demons in their heads. The alcohol helped in the short term, but obviously made everything worse in the long term. A downward spiral that's grimly familiar to anyone who has studied or experienced substance abuse. She also struggled with the loss of her second husband, Alexei Kitsenko, and the memories of all the comrades who hadn't made it through. Survivor's guilt is a real and devastating condition. Why did she survive when so many others, often more skilled or more careful or more deserving, died? There's no good answer to that question, but it haunts survivors nonetheless. The Soviet system didn't provide much in the way of mental health support for veterans. The official narrative was heroic and triumphant. The great patriotic war had been won, fascism had been defeated, the Soviet Union had proven itself the most powerful nation on earth. Veterans were supposed to be proud and grateful, not broken and struggling. Any admission of psychological problems could be seen as ungrateful or even subversive. So Lyudmila, like many veterans, suffered quietly. She did her work as a historian, participated in veterans' organizations, made occasional public appearances when the state needed a war hero to trot out for propaganda purposes, but privately, she was fighting a different kind of battle, one without clear enemies or victories, one where the fight was just to get through each day. In 1957, 15 years after her tour of the United States, Eleanor Roosevelt visited the Soviet Union. The Cold War was in full swing by this point. The countries that had been allies against Hitler were now locked in an ideological and geopolitical struggle that threatened nuclear annihilation. Official relations were frosty at best, and American visitors to the Soviet Union were carefully watched and managed by their KGB handlers. But Eleanor Roosevelt had one non-negotiable demand. She wanted to see her friend, Lyudmila Pavlichenko. She didn't care about diplomatic protocols or Cold War tensions. She had formed a genuine friendship with Lyudmila during the war, and she wasn't going to leave Moscow without seeing her. Soviet authorities eventually granted the request, though they assigned a handler to supervise the visit. They brought Mrs. Roosevelt to the small 2-room apartment in Moscow where Lyudmila was living. It wasn't much, even by Soviet standards. The government had given her this apartment as recognition for her war service, which was actually a significant privilege in the Soviet Union, where housing was scarce and cramped. But it was still just 2 rooms for a decorated hero of the Soviet Union who had been famous internationally. When Eleanor arrived, the reunion started formally and awkwardly, with Lyudmila greeting her old friend with cool formality, while the government handler sat nearby, no doubt noting everything that was said. But then Lyudmila came up with an excuse to pull Eleanor into the bedroom, away from their watchful chaperone. Once they were alone with the door shut, Lyudmila dropped the formal pretense. She threw her arms around Eleanor, half laughing and half crying, telling her how happy she was to see her again. For a brief moment, they were able to really talk, to share news about mutual friends from the 1942 tour, to reminisce about that strange time when they had traveled together across America. It was a stolen moment of genuine human connection in a time and place where such connections were dangerous and heavily monitored. Eleanor would later write fondly about Lyudmila, noting that there was something very charming about the young Russian woman, that she had suffered and was suffering something universal that bound all the world together, regardless of language. It's a beautiful sentiment, recognizing the common humanity beneath the political and ideological divisions. After Eleanor left, Lyudmila returned to her small apartment and her quiet life as a historian. She continued her work with the Soviet Committee of the Veterans of War. She made occasional appearances at state events. She was living proof of Soviet heroism and female capability, a symbol that the state could point to when convenient. But she was also, increasingly, just a middle-aged woman struggling with the aftermath of trauma, with health problems, with the general challenges of life in the Soviet Union during the Khrushchev and then Brezhnev eras. The fame that had once seemed so overwhelming gradually faded. Newer generations came of age without direct memory of World War II. The veterans became elderly. The great struggle that had defined Soviet identity for decades became history rather than lived experience. On October 10, 1974, Lyudmila Pavlichenko died of a stroke in Moscow. She was only 58 years old, but the war and its aftermath had aged her prematurely. The alcohol, the PTSD, the stress, the physical toll of her war wounds, all of it had taken its cumulative effect. She was cremated, and her ashes were placed in the columbarium at the Novodevichy Cemetery in Moscow, one of the most prestigious burial sites in the Soviet Union, where many famous Russians are interred. Her son, Rostislav, who had been 9 years old when the war started, who had grown up with a mother who was simultaneously a famous war hero and a deeply damaged human being, would later be buried next to her when he died in 2007. 2 commemorative Soviet postage stamps were issued in her honor, one in 1943 during the war, and another in 1966 after her death. These stamps ensured that her image and her story would be preserved, at least in the Soviet Union, for future generations. But at the time of her death, Lyudmila Pavlichenko was not particularly famous in the West. The Soviet Union and the United States were on opposite sides of the Cold War. Soviet war heroes were not celebrated in American culture. Her story, extraordinary as it was largely forgotten outside of the Soviet Union and among World War II historians. That would change, slowly, over the decades after her death. But for Lyudmila herself, the end came quietly in a Moscow hospital 32 years after she had killed her last enemy soldier, 33 years after she had volunteered to fight in a war that would consume tens of millions of lives. She had survived the combat. She had survived the war. But in the end, she couldn't entirely survive the peace. The shadows that followed her from Sevastopol and Odessa were too long, too dark, too persistent. They followed her all the way to that hospital bed in 1974. Death is not the end for everyone. Some people fade from memory, their lives and deeds forgotten, except by immediate family and perhaps a few historians specializing in their particular era or field. But others become legends, stories that outlive them, names that continue to resonate long after they've left this world. Lyudmila Pavlichenko is one of the latter. Even before her death, she had become something larger than just a person. The Soviet Union had made her a symbol of female capability and Soviet determination. Her image appeared on postage stamps, in propaganda materials, in newsreels and photographs. She represented something important to the Soviet state, proof that socialist society could produce warriors as capable as any, regardless of gender. But her story also resonated beyond Soviet propaganda. There was something genuinely compelling about this young woman who had mastered one of the most difficult and deadly military skills, who had survived 10 months of combat that killed so many others, who had proven herself again and again in the most brutal testing ground imaginable. In 1942, during Lyudmila's tour of the United States, an American folk singer named Woody Guthrie became aware of her story. Guthrie was one of the most important American musicians of the 20th century, the voice of working-class America, a man who wrote songs about Dust Bowl refugees and labor struggles, and the common people who made up the backbone of the nation. His most famous song, "This Land Is Your Land," remains an American classic. Guthrie was politically radical, sympathetic to communism and the Soviet Union, and he was moved by Lyudmila's story. So he wrote a song about her called Miss Pavlichenko, which was recorded as part of the Ash recordings, a collection that preserved much of Guthrie's work from this period. The song is straightforward and direct in the way Guthrie's songs often were. Miss Pavlichenko's well known to fame. Russia's your country. Fighting is your game. The whole world will love her for a long time to come. For more than 300 Nazis fell by your gun. It goes on. In your mountains and canyons quiet as the deer, down in your big trees knowing no fear, you lift up your sight and down comes a Hun. More than 300 Nazi dogs fell by your gun. The language is simple, almost childlike, but it captures something essential about Lyudmila's story. Here was a woman who had become a hunter, who had taken her skills and used them to lethal effect against an existential enemy. Guthrie predicted that the whole world would love her for a long time to come, and while that might have been optimistic, he was right, that her story would endure. For decades after her death, Lyudmila's story was primarily remembered in the former Soviet Union and among military historians specializing in World War II. But in recent years, there has been a resurgence of interest in her life and achievements, driven by several factors. First, there's been a general increase in interest in women's roles in World War II, particularly in combat roles that were previously overlooked or minimized. As society has become more aware of women's capabilities and contributions in traditionally male domains, stories like Lyudmila's have gained new relevance and attention. Second, the internet has made it easier to discover and share these historical stories. You don't need to be a specialist historian with access to archives to learn about Lyudmila Pavlichenko anymore. Her story is readily available to anyone with an internet connection and curiosity. In 2015, a joint Russian-Ukrainian production created a biographical war film called Battle for Sevastopol, released as Unbreakable in Ukraine. The film, starring Yulia Peresild as Lyudmila, dramatized her wartime experiences, focusing on the sieges of Odessa and Sevastopol and her subsequent tour of the United States. The film took some liberties with the historical record, as such films always do, adding romanticized elements and emphasizing personal trauma over tactical precision. But it brought Lyudmila's story to a new generation and helped ensure that she wouldn't be forgotten. In 2018, the first English-language edition of Lyudmila's own memoirs was published by Greenhill Books under the title Lady Death, The Memoirs of Stalin's Sniper. These memoirs, which had originally been published in Russian during and shortly after the war, provided Lyudmila's own account of her recruitment, training, combat experiences, and her tour of the United States. Reading them gives insight into her voice, her personality, her way of seeing and describing the experiences that defined her life. Lyudmila has also inspired several historical fiction novels. Beautiful Assassin by Michael C. White, published in 2010, is a fictionalized version of her story. Kate Quinn's 2022 novel The Diamond Eye is also based on Lyudmila's life, though Quinn takes significant liberties with the historical record to create her narrative. These novels, while not strictly historical, help keep Lyudmila's story in circulation, exposing her to readers who might never pick up a military history book. Today, Lyudmila Pavlichenko is widely recognized as the most successful female sniper in history. Her tally of 309 confirmed kills stands alone at the top. For comparison, the next most successful female Soviet sniper was Rosa Shanina with 59 confirmed kills. No female sniper from any other nation in any other conflict has come close to Lyudmila's record. She's also recognized as one of the most successful snipers overall, regardless of gender. Her 309 confirmed kills puts her in rare company. Only a handful of snipers in history have accumulated similar tallies. Simo Heiha, the Finnish White Death, with over 500 kills during the Winter War, Ivan Sidorenko with over 500 kills, and a few others. Lyudmila is the only woman in this extremely exclusive club of the most lethal marksmen in military history. But perhaps more importantly than the numbers, Lyudmila's story has become symbolic of women's capability in roles that society has traditionally reserved for men. She proved, beyond any possible doubt, that women could be just as effective as men in one of the most demanding and dangerous military specializations. Her success wasn't an aberration or a fluke. It was the result of natural talent, intensive training, discipline, courage, and determination, the same qualities that make any soldier effective. In recent years, as more militaries around the world have opened all positions to women, including combat roles and special operations, Lyudmila's story has gained new relevance. She is an existence proof, a historical example that can be pointed to. When people claim that women can't handle the demands of combat, she handled them quite successfully, thank you very much, and killed 309 enemy soldiers while doing it. Her friendship with Eleanor Roosevelt has also become a touching footnote to history, a reminder that even in the midst of ideological conflict and global war, human connections can transcend politics and nationality. These two women, from completely different worlds, found something genuine in each other. And Eleanor's insistence on seeing her friend again in 1957, despite the Cold War tensions, speaks to the depth of that connection. Memorials to Lyudmila exist in various places. In addition to her grave at Novodevichy Cemetery in Moscow, there are monuments to her in Sevastopol and in Moldavia, commemorating her wartime service. Her image has appeared on postage stamps, not just in the Soviet Union and later Russia, but in several other countries as well. Museums in Ukraine and Russia preserve artifacts from her life, including her rifle and uniform. But perhaps the most important memorial to Lyudmila Pavlichenko is simply the endurance of her story. More than 80 years after she volunteered for combat, more than 50 years after her death, people are still talking about her, still learning from her example, still inspired by what she accomplished. She was a woman who refused to accept limitations based on gender, a student who became a warrior, a sniper who mastered one of the most demanding military specializations and became one of the best in history at it, a symbol of Soviet determination and female capability, a friend to an American First Lady, a woman who struggled with the aftermath of trauma and loss, a historian who studied the past and then lived through one of its most dramatic chapters. Lyudmila Pavlichenko's life was complicated, marked by both extraordinary achievement and deep personal struggle. She was neither a one-dimensional propaganda figure nor a pure victim of war's trauma. She was fully human, with strengths and weaknesses, triumphs and failures, moments of great courage and periods of struggle. And her story, told and retold across different media and different generations, ensures that she will not be forgotten. Lady Death, the most successful female sniper in history, the woman who killed 309 men and then had to find a way to live with what she had done, continues to fascinate and inspire more than 8 decades after she first raised a rifle in anger. So here we are, at the end of this journey through the life of Lyudmila Pavlichenko. We've traced her story from that small Ukrainian village where a competitive tomboy refused to let boys outdo her at anything, through her years as a university student training in marksmanship almost as a hobby, into the hell of combat on the Eastern Front, through her propaganda tour of the United States, and finally to her quiet death in a Moscow hospital at the age of 58. What can we take away from this remarkable life? First, I think, is the reminder that people are capable of far more than society often believes or allows. Lyudmila was told, explicitly and implicitly, that certain things were not for her because she was a woman. Combat roles were for men. Sniping was for men. The front lines were for men. She could be a nurse, sure, or work in a factory, or teach school, but she couldn't be a warrior. She proved them wrong in the most definitive way possible. Not through argument or rhetoric, but through results. 309 confirmed kills, 36 successful counter-sniper duels, 10 months of combat service, wounds, promotions, decorations, and ultimately the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. The numbers don't lie. The results speak for themselves. Second, we're reminded of the terrible costs of war. Lyudmila survived the combat, but it damaged her deeply and permanently. The PTSD, the depression, the alcoholism, the early death, all of these were directly traceable to those 10 months she spent in combat. She killed 309 enemy soldiers, but in doing so, she also wounded herself in ways that never fully healed. This doesn't diminish her achievements. She did what needed to be done in an existential struggle for her nation's survival. But it's important to remember that warriors, even successful ones, pay a price for their service that often lasts long after the shooting stops. Third, there's something to be said about the power of determination and discipline. Lyudmila wasn't some naturally gifted superhuman who could effortlessly accomplish things others couldn't. She was a person who worked hard, trained extensively, pushed herself constantly, and refused to give up even when things were difficult. Her success as a sniper came from a combination of natural talent and relentless practice and improvement. This is actually an encouraging lesson. It suggests that human potential is often greater than we assume, that with sufficient determination and effort, people can master incredibly difficult skills and accomplish extraordinary things. Lyudmila wasn't born a sniper. She became one through hard work and discipline. Finally, I think we're reminded of the importance of preserving and telling these stories. Lyudmila Pavlichenko's story could have been lost. She died during the Cold War when East-West relations were hostile. She could have been dismissed as Soviet propaganda. Her achievements could have been minimized or forgotten. But people kept telling her story. Woody Guthrie wrote his song. Historians documented her service. Journalists wrote articles. Filmmakers made movies. And now, more than 80 years after she volunteered for combat, we're still talking about her, still learning from her example, still inspired by what she accomplished. History is full of remarkable people whose stories have been lost simply because no one bothered to preserve them. Lyudmila was fortunate that her story was preserved, and we're fortunate that we can learn from it. So remember Lyudmila Mikhailovna Pavlichenko. Remember the tomboy from Bila Tserkva who refused to accept limitations. Remember the university student who practiced marksmanship as a hobby. Remember the soldier who killed 309 enemy combatants in 10 months of combat. Remember Lady Death, one of the most successful snipers in history. Remember the woman who befriended an American First Lady. Remember the historian who lived through history. Remember the veteran who struggled with trauma. Remember the human being who was complicated and flawed and extraordinary. Her story matters. It reminds us of what people are capable of, both in terms of achievement and in terms of the costs of war. It challenges our assumptions and pushes us to think differently about capability and gender, and courage and trauma.